Now we're finishing Perek Zayin. We're at the end of Perek Zayin. You never finish, yeah? You move on to the next thing, but you never finish. We're holding Obazeh Yuvan Maimed Azar, which is on page 24. Yud Beis Amud Beis, and it is 7 lines before the end of the paragraph, or the 4th line of the narrow lines, which is adjacent to the Hagor on that page, which is page 24. I'm going to get straight in, okay? We make believe that we're learning Tanya instead of... I'll find ways of talking in circles anyways. I do it professionally. But we'll try this. I'll make it hard for myself to waste time, okay? The toichin of this Perek is a hemshech to the last Perek. What are we talking about? We're talking about Klippah. And when you talk about Klippah, it's just like Lahavdil when you talk about Kedusha. Just like when the Rebbe talked about Kedusha, there were 2 things. There was Kedusha in theory, and then when the Jew gets involved with it, Hashem created Kedusha, and then when a Yid does Teirah mitzvahs, they're activating Kedusha. They say with Lahavdil and Umazeh and Klippah that there's 2 things. There's the creation of Klippah, to whatever extent and in whatever way and in whatever understanding Klippah is a mitzvah. And then there is what happens when a Yid activates Klippah. And for the most part, it's very precise here, because it's not entirely true. It's what separates Perek Vav and Perek Zayin. Chapter 6 spoke about Klippah. Chapter 7 discusses what happens to people when they meet Klippah. Now it's not entirely true, because the first few lines, the Eshte Parshudas, introduce Klippas Noiga in theory, but he almost immediately moves on to the discussion of action. So you have these two discussions. Good morning, Mama Liebe. You have these 2 discussions. The first is what Klippah is in general, and then you have 2 madregas in Klippah. Klippas was rois tmeyes legamri, and then you have a Klippah which is bechina madrega bemutzas bein Klippas atmeyes legamri and bechina madrega gedusha which is Klippas nega. That's one discussion. Then there is a second discussion, and the second discussion is what happens when a Yid touches Klippah. And here we have all kinds of details. And so far we've had basically 3. I mean, it's obviously, when you learn Tanya, it ain't safe. It never finishes. It's Tanya Shabbat. But we have basically 3 ideas. The first idea is when a Yid partakes of permitted Klippas Noiga, which is called in the Tanya Mutter. Mutter does not only mean permitted, Mutter means untied. Nicht zugebunden, untied, not bound down, not tied down. So the Rebbe says a person who engages in Klippah, that's mutter, never becomes asr. And the meaning of asr doesn't mean prohibited. Asr means shackled, trapped. A person who enjoys permitted matters of this world in a way that's not exactly consistent with Kedusha, it's not a good thing. But it's not also. It's not forever. You're not stuck. Because it's kosher. You do it again, you fix it, you raise it up, you use it in a different way, and so on and so forth. So Klippas Noiga, if you use it l'shem shamayim, it becomes Kedusha. If you use it with no particular kavanah, even after you used it remains what it was before, Klippas Noiga. If you used it l'shem in a way that inappropriate, it goes down to sholosh klippas of meis legamri, but the Alter Rebbe uses the expression lefi sho'ah. It's temporary. It can easily be fixed. This is conversation 1. Okay? That Klippas Noiga is called mutter. It never ever shackles you down in perpetuity in what the Rebbe calls ra in tumah. But then you have Klippas atmez arois legamri, real bad stuff. Aveire. And this is called isur or asur. Asur means it shackles you, it ties you down, it locks you up. Locks you up means once you're involved, can't get out, stuck. An Aveda is forever. There's 2 ways to reverse that idea. One is to wait for Mashiach to come and for the Eibishter to unlock all the prisons. Yibula Mavas Lanetzach Achi Yavi Yema. At Ace case Yavi Yema Yibula Mavas Lanetzach, and the Eibishter Maven Tuma Min Haaretz, and then he's done. And the other was called Tshuva Meyava Rabbi. Tshuva Meyava Rabbi Kol Kach Aches Deinis Nasas Lekezochias. The Aveda becomes a mitzvah because the Aveda motivated the Tshuva. The Aveda stood in the Tshuva. That's issue 2. Okay? Last week we had issue 3. What was issue 3? Avedas that don't happen so much in the physical world. They happen primarily up here. And this third category, which is Avedas that don't happen so much in the physical world, happen more spiritually, the Rebbe, even though they're Avedas, and they're Asur. What does Asur mean? They trap you in Klippa. The Rebbe adds, there's a Riboy Hatuma b'ma'oid, like it says in Svarim. But since it's an Aveda, which is primarily here, not in the goof of the person, the Rebbe Lashon, Tshuva nechoina b'krishma shalamita is enough. You don't have to have Tshuva mi'avad Rabba, Tshuva where you have to spill your intestines out in doing Tshuva, and this is sufficient. Those were the 3 conversations we had. Now I'm going to say this one more time, okay? I'm going to summarize my summary. Number 1, heter. A person who vows in Gashmi is again, let's remember again. There's 2 big discussions. The 2 big discussions are, number 1, Klippa, and number 2, what happens when a Yid and Klippa get involved. We're in the middle of the second discussion, when a Yid and a Klippa get involved. And when a Yid and a Klippa get involved, we've had so far 3 ideas. The first idea is called heter. Heter means that in the worst case scenario, it's rectifiable, it's fixable relatively easily. The second is called Isser. Isser is not, it's a bad idea. Avedas are a terrible idea because they're forever unless you do tshuva on the highest madrega. Then there's a third level, which is on the one hand Isser. It's in the category of things that you're not allowed to do because they tie you down, but it's primarily a spiritual Aveda, an Aveda of the mind and the heart. And because it's a spiritual Aveda and the physical aspect of it is not the Iked is the pneumistic aspect of it, so Tshuva Nechoina B'Krishma Shalamita is enough. A complete Tshuva. Tshuva Nechoina has a definition. Because when you get a Tshuva, you have something called Iker HaTshuva Menatera. Iker Mitzvah Tshuva Menatera, Tshuva is a very simple thing. Tshuva in its most elemental level is simply not to do it again, that's all. But Tshuva Nechoina, that you're not going to be punished for it, it requires much more than that. But it's not Tshuva law. It's comprehensive Tshuva, but it's not Tshuva law, whatever those things mean. So these are the 3 ideas we've had until now. Okay? Heter and Isser. Then we had a category of Isser, which is primarily a linyan Ruchni. So the Alter Rebbe says the Lashon that Tshuva Nechoina Bekavana Atzuma Bekrishma Shalamita, even if it's only on a lower level, that means on a level of Tshuva Tatorah, is satisfactory, is sufficient. This is what we learned in last week's class. Now I will now commit my regular sin, which is I'm going to repeat to you the Nakuda of last week's class, not because I need to, but because I want to, because it's something you say this the Gazach. It's such a real thing. It's such an emes Zach in life. Right? You know, we talk about this all the time. But there's 2 tshuvas. There's a lower tshuva and a higher tshuva. The difference between the lower tshuva and the higher tshuva is not necessarily intensity, you know. The lower tshuva, I didn't mean it so much. The higher tshuva, I meant it more. That's not the difference. The lower tshuva is departure from sin. Departure from sin. The higher tshuva is re-engagement with God. The lower tshuva is about fixing wrongs. The higher tshuva is about coming back to the Meibishter. You know what? Everything is about Hashgacha Pratis. I had the incredible chus for the first time in my life to go spend a Shabbos in the Chabad house of one of my children. For me, it's a first. I mean, for you, this is no big deal. For me, it was incredible. And I met a Yid named Feil, who knew the Rebbe, had Yechidesen. I had some time to verbringen. So he shared with me 2 tshuva vertes. One is his, that the Rebbe told him in Yechidus, and the other the Rebbe told his friend. I said, you got to write this down. He says, well, I don't write down, I revisit it. But one of my kids said, Whatever you told my father, the whole world is going to know. So here we go. He had a yechidus, and his yechidus was 20 minutes. 20 minutes, his first yechidus. He asked the Rebbe all kinds of questions, but amongst them he asked theological questions, religion and faith questions. So the Rebbe told him, this is all Yetzer Hara. The Rebbe didn't answer. This is all Yetzer Hara. Tell your Yetzer Hara, this is what the Rebbe told him. The way he told it to me, that this is ois ba'ois. In other words, he said it as if it's verbatim. So first of all, I'm not sure I'm repeating what he said. Second of all, I'm not sure if he remembers it. Tell your Yetzer Hara to go away. You have no time for him. You're busy learning Torah. So the Rebbe told him, tell your Yetzer Hara to go away. You have no time for busy learning Torah. He asked the Rebbe questions in Amunah. Yes, the religion and faith, whatever questions. He was a kid. This is what Rebbe told him. By the way, this man said to me, his first inspiration to become frum was Chaim Potak's book, The Chosen. He said to him, Chaim Potak's book, The Chosen, is the book of Kfirah. He says, but he describes Shabbos. So he describes Shabbos, and I want Shabbos. So I guess it's a mixed bag. Did ever Shak Makalik for Chaim Potak? And I couldn't understand why. He says to me, his first trigger to become a Frum Yid was Chaim Potak. The whole book describes failure. He says, but he describes Shabbos. Anyway, that's the first story. And the second story is what a Chavarav is. He says, I can find it online. I looked for this morning, I couldn't find it. That a friend of his, Mamish, Chaverim together, they grew up together to high school together. And he also became a Baal Tshuva. He learned here in Hadar HaTeira. And he told me that he said that he went into the Rebbe, and he talked about the Rebbe, the fact that his entire childhood and adolescence, he wasn't frum. And he had his whole collection of Avedas that he was guilty of, or that he was guilted by. And he wanted the Rebbe to help him figure out how to deal with his past. So the Rebbe said to him, you're so busy thinking about yourself. You're Avedas. Stop thinking about yourself, so think about the Torah. So the Rebbe told him. In other words, the Rebbe said to him, the answer to all the things in your past is, your concern about them is not the wrong. It's your imperfection. Let go. Laws up. These are two stories that I heard yesterday that are certainly worth coming Sunday morning in the rain in Zion here to 770 base Mendesh and Nashma Rabban 770 to here. Richtig? Because this is Divrei Arak. This is nothing to do with me. I'm just a mashpech. I heard it yesterday. I'm repeating it today. That's what I do for a living. I collect and I distribute. One guy collects and he gives what he got. The other guy collects and he makes new stuff and gives it back. I'm working on that. Maybe I shouldn't work on that. I should work on what I'm doing now. But anyway, back to the Nidun, to us. There's two concepts in Tshuva. One concept in Tshuva, I got to go from my way. Another concept in Tshuva, I got to turn to the Rebbe. The Rebbe Bechlal, our Rebbe, our Rebbe, always talked about returning to God. He really didn't want people thinking about sin, because he saw it as a trap. As a trap, you get stuck. Connect to Ha'mevish. But in Tanya, yes, a tshuva. You learn about two tshuvas: tshuva tata and tshuva la, lower tshuva and higher tshuva. The lower tshuva is to rid ourselves, to dissociate ourselves, to break the shackles of what's called isser, the entrapment that Naveda has on a person. You got to get away from the sin. And then beyond that is tshuva la. Tshuva la is to reconnect to the Eibush. So the Alter Rebbe introduced us to an idea here, and by the way, this is discussed by Arichas Negev Satshuva in Perik Dalet, and then later on in Perik Zay, Perik Ches, I suppose, that most Aveidas happen on both levels. Most sins, every time you do a sin, Nachman al-Itzlan, it's two sins. You do something wrong. A person, not you, a person does something wrong. A person does something wrong, there's two misdeeds. The first is to stop thinking about Hashem. Because when you think about Hashem, you don't do Hekach Tzayne Yisborach. To stop focusing on the Eibush, that's the first thing. When you stop focusing on the Eibush, then you become vulnerable to the Yetzer Hara's probe, to the Yetzer Hara's pushing at your weaknesses, and you could fall, a person could fall, and do anything late. So every Aveda is two Avedas. The first Aveda is that we stop paying attention to the Eibush, and the second Aveda is because we're not thinking about our higher selves. Our basic self is vulnerable and can, God forbid, fall. So the Alter Rebbe says some Avedas are entirely the first thing. They're not the second thing. Or kamat, not the second. Some Avedas, Ikir in Yonam, is that I forgot God. They're also Isser. They're also Isser. What is the meaning of Isser? Tie down, shackle down into Klippe. But some Avedas, even though they're Isser, are primarily what you call in Tanya Yutke, not Vovke. The spiritual involvement, when I stop thinking about the Eibishter, kach v'kach, a person could fall into this inyan. So the Rebbe says those Avedas are easier to fix because they didn't happen in the world. They didn't happen in the world. Okay? So now that I repeated briefly what we learned last week, I'm going to summarize a third time the 3 steps. Okay? Step number 1, heter, untied. You did something you shouldn't have done, but it's the state of heter. It's always reversible. State number 2, isser, which means it's tied down. I did something I shouldn't have done, and I'm stuck with it. It's not very difficult to fix. The third is isser, but isser on a spiritual level. It tied me down into a place which isn't good, but it didn't come. It wasn't defined primarily by an action. This is easier to correct. This leads us to category 4, which is the most severe of all. In other words, you'll see now as we read why I repeated myself so many times. It says the Rebbe b'zeyuvan ma'merazam. Once we understand these 3 categories of the involvement of a yid in klipa, heter and isser, and isser which is not so connected to gashmi, so it's easier to reverse, we can explain a very interesting Gemara, a very uncomfortable Gemara. The Gemara says, Eze me'uvas shal yuchal esikun, liske, sakin. What is a sin? It's a pasuk. Me'uvas yuchal sakin is a biblical text. A sin which is uncorrectable. Eze me'uvas yuchal sakin. The Gemara asks the question, what is a sin which is uncorrectable? And the Gemara brings 2 examples. One example is that if you miss Kishma in time, right? Women, this is one of the reasons to be a woman. You're not mechuyev in Krishma. It's one of the most difficult ones. Krishma is a deiraisa. It's a Krishma before a certain hour, even after the Seder, and even after Adalayada, you have to get up in the morning and say Krishma in time. Yeah? If you miss Krishma, the time is gone. You can't make up for yesterday's Krishma. Yesterday's gone. It's like missing a day in Sfida. You can't make it up. But that's a mitzvah say. Right? If I missed a sin of omission, I missed doing a good thing, I can't get it back. But then the Gemara brings a second example, which is a sin of commission. God forbid the person didn't have Aveda, and it leaves a permanent mark in the world. It's called a mamzer. The person didn't have Aveda. It's terrible, yeah? Terrible thing. The person didn't have Aveda. And Avedas have many aspects. We've talked about this many times. I'm probably going to repeat it to you momentarily. Avedas have many aspects. But usually when you did an Aveda, after you did it, it's done. It's gone. It took a minute. It took 5 minutes. It took a day. It's finished. It's over. What happens when a person does an Aveda and the Aveda lives forever in this world? You know what that's called in halacha? In halacha it's called Chilul Hashem. But you know the Gemara, right? You know the Gemara because it's not mentioned in the Geras HaTshuva. A person that makes a Chilul Hashem, there's no tshuva. There's no tshuva Chilul Hashem. Why? You can do tshuva all you want. The person who's walking around turned off to the Eibishter B'Teira Mitzvahs because of Pliny Ben Pliny is still turned off. You know, that's what Chilul Hashem means. Chilul Hashem means I did something wrong that affected somebody else's sense of Hashem. Chilul, I affected a chilul, a weakening, a making ordinary, a making vochadik, einfach, Hashem. So I can do all I want. The Chilul Hashem walking the street. The Alter Rebbe, the Gemara, is called a mamzer. A mamzer is a walking Chilul Hashem. The Aveda happened years ago, but the Chilul Hashem is walking the street. So the Rebbe says, Ubazeh, based on the distinction we made last week from the weeks before, that there's 2 categories of Isser. There's a category of Isser which is defined primarily by an action, versus a category of Isser which is defined primarily by a spirit. And we argued that an Aveda that's defined primarily by an action is more difficult to correct than an Aveda which is defined by a spirit. What's worse, doing something wrong or misdirecting your mind? Misdirecting your mind, you become a shura, you're all about your mind. So the Tanya says, no. Your mind went crazy. If it didn't translate into a deed, nish gefährlich. You did something wrong, gefährlich. Ubazeh, when you understand this distinction, that if you did an Aveda, if the Aveda happened in your mind, tshuva nechoina and krish b'shalamita is enough. You don't have to spill your guts or wait for tchias hamesim to happen to repair it. But an Aveda which has to do with a ma'aseh is isur. It's much more difficult to correct. It explains the Gemara. That the Gemara says the worst thing of an Aveda is what stays behind. That's the pshat in the Gemara. Mu'uvas liyuchal asakin asim, which is irreparable as eshabola erev v'helid mamzer. If you did something wrong, and what you did wrong continues to be in the world, it's not for a minute. You can do all the tshuva you want. That representation of Chilul Hashem that exists in the world continues to be the sin, and this has no tikkun. So what's the hemshech hadvarim? What's the flow? The flow is the Alter Rebbe is quoting Kabbalah's Sfarim. When we learn Tanya, it all reads easy. We don't understand that the Alter Rebbe is distilling all of Kisvei Arizal and all of Zoyar and all of Sifrei Musar. In the Tanya, you have the best of all the Kabbalah Sfarim and Sifrei Musar. All of this is based on quotes from Arizal, quotes Kabbalah Sfarim. It's not Stamazay. This is what the Alter Rebbe his mood is. He says an Aveira that doesn't happen in the physical world, notwithstanding how terrible it is to contaminate the mind and the heart, is much easier to correct than an Aveira that can done to an action. And accordingly, an Aveira that can done to an action that passes is much easier to correct than an Aveira that can done to an action where the action persists. It's called a mamzer. It's called a Chilul Hashem. You can't fix that. It's here. It's a part of the world. Because the ikir, chesaron of an Aveira is what happens here, not what's happening here. This is what the Alter Rebbe. This is a fourth category. This is a worse Isser than Isser. Why? Because it's out of your hands. It's out of your hands. You didn't have any the tshuva. The tshuva meyava rabba, you can correct it. But the mamzers walking the street. The Chilul Hashem exists. It's out of your hands. It's what other people know based on my actions. Based on my actions. Achman al-Islam. Another person is turned of Torah mitzvahs. I can do whatever I want. He's turned of Torah mitzvahs. This becomes the worst isser. The worst entrapment. The worst shackling in Iran is when the mamzer is walking in the street. This is a fourth category. You see, this is a fourth category. I'm a teacher. I'm not a preacher. I'm a teacher. So we have to quantize everything, put everything into learning form. In this page, there's 4 steps, 4 levels of what happens when a Jew touches klipper. The first is called Isser. The second is called Isser, which is first is called Heter. The second is called Isser, which is connected to Gashmias. The third is called Isser, which is primarily Ruchnias. And the fourth is called Isser, which is connected to Gashmias that lasts. And by explaining us the contrast, the difference between 2 and 3, the Alter Rebbe is able to introduce us to number 4. You see, that's the Ubazeh Yuvan. By saying that an Aveira that happens by Ruchnias is much easier to correct than an Aveira what's happening by Gashmias, the Alter Rebbe further says an Aveira that happens by Gashmias is easier to correct than an Aveira that happens by Gashmias, which is out of my hands because it's walking the earth. It's called the Chilul Hashem. It's called the mamzer. And that's the fourth category. And the Alter Rebbe finishes Sha'al that under those conditions, even if a person does the kind of tshuva that we described before, which will tshuva mi'av rabba, the holiness of that event cannot be raised up to holiness. It's in this world. It's in the body of a person, or in the body of many people. And consequently, this is even more difficult to correct. So, on a limud level, on an intellectual level, on a learning of limud, the Alter Rebbe in Perek Zayin, gave us 4 madreges, if you will, of the involvement of the person with a chet. Heter, Isser, which is connected to Gashmias, Isser, which is primarily Beruchnias, and Isser, which is connected to Gashmias, that becomes beyond the sinner, it becomes the sin, it becomes a Metzias in this world. This is what we just learned, okay? So now I have 2 things to say, and I don't know which one to say first. So I'll say the second one first, okay? And the second thing is the famous story, which is brought on this particular Tanya from the Adama Pekerech Ivrim. It's actually a long story in Chabad tradition. that contradicts these 6 lines of Tanya. Mamish, it contradicts these Tanya. Yesterday I was in a base medrash. I talked about my children, and I told the story, but I told the story in a way that was Chabad House correct. I didn't focus on Avedis and on Mamzeder, but I told the story. The story is very, very well known. And it's brought in the Yiddish Tanya, which the Rebbe edited, they bring the Maisi here. So I'm going to share with you the story. Okay, you all know the story, but you can hear it again. Because of the kids. The story is as follows. That the Frierdiker Rebbe, upon him, he can't Yid. No. Not the Frierdiker. The Marash. But he can't Yid, but he hasten Rabbi Asher Zelig. Rabbi Asher Zelig. Rabbi Asher Zelig. Rabbi Asher Zelig used to come to Lubavitch, I think. And this Rabbi Asher Zelig was the son of a Yid who had been a chassid of the Alter Rebbe and a chassid of the Mittel Rebbe, who was called Rabbi Yossi Balagola. Yossi the coachman. They used to call him in an earlier incarnation Yosef Mashpir Bor. He was a Goan Elam and Teira, and he was a big Magachi. He taught it very well, and they called him Yosef Mashpir Bor because when he taught you something, you understood it like as if you just bought a pound of bread. His hasbara was incredible. Yosef Yibel. The Asher Zelig repeated, I think, to the Rebbe Marash, the story of his father that happened with the Alter Rebbe and the Mittel Rebbe. And this is the story. This Rabbi Yosef was a very big Talmid Chacham. He was an Ilui. And as was the custom in those times, he married a girl, a Bas Tev, in a very chashuv mishpach, a very prominent family. Her father was also a big Goan, a big Talmid Chacham. And in those times, Teir and Gedula went together. If you were a big Talmid Chacham, you married rich. So rich people and learned people were usually in the same class. And she supported him. She supported him. He sat and learned. She had some kind of a business. And they lived many years together. And he was a Yid, a Mufshet from Elam Hazi, who his whole life was Teir and Avedim. At one point in his life, he came to the Alter Rebbe. And he became a Chosid. And he had also Avedas Hashem, a Derech HaChassidus. He was a Hashem. And eventually his wife passed away. Let's say when his wife passed, he was in his 50s. Yeah? So he was old by one measure and young by another measure. And they never had any children. So he was obviously very upset. He'd been married, let's say, for 30 years or 40 years. And he came to the Alter Rebbe for nichumin, for consolation. And he had a yechidus. And the yechidus, Alter Rebbe told him the following. You should marry a woman young enough to bear children. I'll have a question, promised him children. Which is like, wow. Wow. He had no kids. And then the Alter Rebbe added some cryptai just for fun. For the source of your soul, it's preferred that you be a wagon driver than a kamarov. So he had a promise for children from the Alter Rebbe if he would marry a woman young enough to bear children. So he found a woman young enough to bear children. But she was a far cry from his first wife. Forgive me for using dirty words. She was from a different class. She was a Yisema. She was an orphan. She grew up impoverished. She had been married to somebody else, and I don't know if they had children, who was also from that class. She was a very simple woman. She didn't understand Torah. She didn't understand Avodah. She certainly didn't understand the Rebbe. She was a simple woman. A mamash, a simple woman, married to this God. He was a God who be Yisrael. They got married, and he continued living his life like before. She supported him. This was a tradition. Talking about women's liberation. The women supported their husbands. All the B'nai Torah, the Gedolei Yisrael, the women supported them. It's a fact of life. And they had a son. And they named their son after her father, Asher Zelig. They had one son, Asher Zelig. And this Rabbi Asher Zelig would years later tell the story. Anyway, he's living his life. Now he's in his mid-60s. Late 60s. And this is more than a decade after that Yechidus. Many years had passed. Because you remember the Alter Rebbe gave him a brach, an eitzah and a brach. Marry a woman young enough to have children, but she must have been 20 years as a junior at least. And you'll be there to have Zarachai B'Chiyam, and he had a child. And then it happens one day, he is visited by a delegation from the Jewish community in Kiev, which is the capital of Ukraine. It's one of the most prominent communities in Eastern Europe at that time. And they were looking for a Rav. And they offered him the position. It was such an honor. It's like being elected president of the United States. It was such a cover. The very fact that they sought him out, he had never held a Rabbanis before. He was never a Rav. It wasn't like they came to a rabbi of a small town and said, Mufti. Rabbanim in those days used to get, what's the word? Upgrades. There's a better word for it. Promotions, they call it. Promotions. No, I'm talking about something else. I'm talking about business budget. You got a job as a Rav in a small shtetl. If your name and fame would spread, you would get a better position. And sometimes Rabbanim would go from small villages to big cities, and they would curse the day they made that change, because the big city came with so much politics. They were so much more lucky before. He had never held that Rabbanis. It wasn't like he wasn't making a promotion. He was a private citizen. He was a Yidusad, and he was considering it. What an offer! He's an elderly man. He has a wife. He has a child. A Rabbanis, the Parnasa will be wonderful. He would have probably been bred. But the responsibility and the power and the opportunity to be a Rav Yisrael made it to be so. And then suddenly he remembered the second part of the Yechidus. Now the Rebbe said to him, it's best it's better for your neshama. It's a mystical thing, God, to be a coachman than a Rav. So he figures now that he was offered a Rabbanis, now is the time to carry out this instruction. Imagine a Jew who's 67 years old, who never did as much as put a box on a shelf. He never worked. So he went down to the stable, the edge of town, where the Balagola waited for people who needed to take trips, like waiting by a taxi line in an airport, you understand? And he comes down to the stable, and one of the Balagola gets up, Rabbi Yosef, wo will tirigehen? Rabbi Yosef, where would you like to go? He said, I don't want to go anyplace. What can we help you with? I want you to teach me how to drive a coach. And the whole line of coachmen started laughing. And they all said, no, are you crazy? You're an old man. You're one foot on the banana peel and the other foot you know where. You're going to drive a horse? What do you know about fed and avog? A horse and a wagon is a lot more complicated than a car and an engine and a carburetor, you understand? Anyway, one of the guys took pity on him. He said, okay, I'll teach you. Took him into the barn, listened to the horse. Within 15 minutes, he had been kicked and whiplashed. And he had fallen into what exists on the floors of stables. He was cut and bruised and filthy and smelly. It was a disaster. The whole town heard that Yossel Balagola, Mashpir Bor, lost his mind. He comes home, Haman came home after the taking Mordechai around. He smelled and he was torn up. His wife got word that her holy husband snapped. He walks into the house, and she's standing over the crib or the cradle of the bed of their son, crying. She married this holy guy, and he brought a child into the world, and now he went off to the pasture on a farm. She sees him, so she immediately puts on a good face and tries to act like everything is in order. He doesn't say a word. Takes off his clothes, puts on new clothes, cleans himself up, goes back to his centers to learn like as if it never happened. Temporary insanity. 3 days he's doing this, and he's eating himself up inside. Because the Alter Rebbe told him, after 3 days, he decides to do what the Gemara says. That's how the story is told. That when a person is not sure what to do, talk to your wife. Common sense. Talk to your wife. The Gemara Meferesh. Imlich betvis. But he doesn't understand how she's even going to appreciate this. If this was his first wife, she would have understood exactly what the deal was. But what's a simple woman, are you saying? But the Gemara says, look, this is my wife. So he comes into her and he tells her, I got to tell you, you think I lost my mind for a few hours. I'll tell you what happened. And he tells her the ganze Meise. She gets very excited. Immediately. And she says, I will sell my jewelry. I will pawn my leichte. You will buy a horse and wagon and you'll do what the Rebbe said. So the Yosef Balagola was now in a new turmoil. I'm a chassid of the Alter Rebbe. I learned his chassidus. He taught me the Eibush. I had multiple yechidus. And I have questions whether I should actually do it. My wife doesn't know what the Alter Rebbe looks like. And she bought in, as soon as she heard that it was a Rav from the Rebbe, the fact that people would think he's crazy was completely lost. She was thrilled to find out. He didn't lose his mind. So now we had a new agony. How could it be? My wife's a bigger chassid than me. So there's a whole Hemshech HaSipur that he went to a Fabrengen of Chassidim, and there was a Yid there, I think his name was Yeshua, Chaim Yeshua maybe, I don't remember the name, who was a coachman, a Chassid, a Chabad Chassid, Balagova. And the Chassidim sat around at a Fabrengen, and he saw that this coachman was not treated any different. That by Chassidim didn't make a difference. He was a Chassidish Shirida. The fact that he made a living with horses was immaterial. So this was very heartening to him. This was very encouraging. So after the Fabrengen, he pulled him aside, and he told him the ganze Maise. And of course, this Chassid had no problem whatsoever, and he taught him the trade. And the Yosef became a coachman. It's a Bislah. But the Alter Rebbe never told him he has to become rich, he has to buy a herd of horses and have a whole bunch of employees. He didn't know how hard to work. So he worked of Yetzer Venus. He got up in the morning, and he said Chtzos, and he lived Shoyz Nachanan Nigled, and he davened Barichas. 2-3 in the afternoon, he was ready for his horse and wagon. After 15 minutes, the sun set, you understand, he didn't overwork. He did his job. He did it, but he didn't do it Behidr or Behidr Dehidr. You understand, he probably didn't make a living driving his coach. But he followed the instructions of the Rebbe. He did it for 2 years. He became a shlepet. He was still the Gaon and Chassid that he had been. People realized that he was not crazy. And that Meknesiba Meshura, nobody knew why. He had taken this turn in his life, but he was still the same Gaon, the same Chassid, same Eved Elokim. And he did his whole coacherai, his whole being a coachman, very b'diavad. He was traveling from place to place, delivering people or wares, and he came to an inn where he was going to spend the night. As he was there was another coachman there as well, and in walks a man whose French name, I don't remember at the moment, but his Hebrew name was Shlomo Leib. This man had been frum, and he had a wife and family that he had Pashat run off on, abandoned. He didn't give his wife a get to it, like a man. She run off on him. What happened was, he made friends with a young poritz, with a young squire, a young rich nobleman. And at first it was just casual, and then they became good friends, and then he started to do entertainment together, and then he became very close to this nobleman, and he abandoned his family, and he became the right hand of this nobleman. He married a Shiksa Rachman Lasan and 2 Goyish kids. And he left his Yiddish wife and children, just abandoned them. And he was living high on the hog. He was living like a real Rachman Lasan Mishkan Yid. He rolls into this motel with the Gans and Breit guy, and he asks for food. He said, listen, tomorrow morning I need to go. Get me a coachman. Get me a balago. So the proprietor says like this, you can have an early one or a late one. Shlomo so-and-so is ready at 6 o'clock in the morning. And then there's Yossel. What? But Yossel, he never rushes. So he says to the proprietor, Yossel is sitting in the room, on the other side of the room. It's like a dining room, I'm imagining. And he says, he's a coachman. He says, yeah. When can he take me? So Yossel says, Noch and Davden. How does he know Noch and Davden means 4 in the afternoon? Noch and Davden can be 7:30 in the morning also, after Davden. So he answers very rudely, Ich darf nicht Davden. I'm not into the Davdening business. I need the time to shower and eat. When should I get up? To me, the following sentence, I think, is the story. He didn't look like a Yid, obviously. He didn't look like a Yid. And you're talking in an age that there was no such thing as a secular Jew. There was either a Yid or a Meshuman, Rachman Otzah. So Rabbi Yosef Hazog, this Yosef, the Rebbe Zachosim says, "Vos hara Yid darf nicht daven." What kind of Jew does not need to pray? So he got very irritated, and he says to the proprietor, "Get me the other one." The guy gets up early. End of story. Yosef goes to his room, and he says, "Kishur Shalamita." Sleeps at midnight and gets a chtzas. And in the next room, I mean, I don't know how the story happened exactly, but this Yid couldn't sleep. Whether it was hearing the Yosef say Kishur Shalamita, just a comment. What do you mean, now you're a Yid? He was completely immovable. He couldn't down. Couldn't sleep. The Yosef doesn't know anything of it. He's in his little room. He says Tikich Chtzos. Then he sits and learns till in the morning. Then he probably went in Vaser, he went to table, and he prepared himself to daven. And he's until 3 in the afternoon. The coachman who was supposed to take this Shlomo Leib gets up in the morning, and Shlomo Leib says, "No, I can't go." He's very irritated. He's very arrogant. He's very irritated. He's very out of himself. He says, "You leave. I'm waiting for the other one." When he finishes davening, he knocks on his door. The Rebbe opens and he sees this man who we know as Shlomo Leib, his face is red. He says, "Can I borrow your tefillin?" Sure. He gives him his tefillin. He goes to his room, and he davens b'chiyas atzumis. He does pasha tshuva for a life of real sin. You hurt another person. If you did something to God, there's one thing. You hurt another person, your own wife, your own children. And Rabbi Yosef realizes that this man is going through an epiphany. And he feels like he has to see this through. It's sort of his responsibility. So he cancels whatever trip he has and he stays. Within a day or two, this Shlomo Leib becomes so upset that he gets physically ill. To the point, well, I forgot to tell you, he tells Yosef the truth. He tells Yosef the ganze emes. He tells him the story. Who he was and what he abandoned and what he's become and how he could never fix his life. He can never return to his family and so on and so forth. And he gets so sick. This is in the beginning. And then over the course of the few years, he gets so sick, he's mamish, he's delirious. The Poritz, his boss, hears that his best friend is ill. So he immediately dispatches a wagon, a coach, to this motel to bring him to the palace to give him care. By the time he arrives, you can't move him. You're going to kill him. So he dispatches his doctor, a personal doctor, a good physician, to examine him. The doctor comes and there's nothing to do. He's laying in bed, writhing in agony, crying out. And he's saying the name of his wife and his children. This happens over the course of a number of days. During those few days, a word arrives to the motel that his goyish wife and children died in an accident. Now, the doctor who's caring for him assumes he's crying out the name of his wife and kids. Mistama, he has a premonition that something bad happened to them. But Yosef knows the truth. So he says to the doctor, I want to go into this patient. He says, listen, this patient is near death, and any kind of irritation, any kind of excitement could kill him. I can't let you in. He said, listen, you can't do anything with him, right? You've admitted you can't help him. Give me a shot. He said, I'm just telling you, the guy died, it's on you. He goes in and he whispers into his ear that his goyish children and wife are dead. And he opens his eyes, he sits up. When a half an hour passes, he's himself, he's very weak. The way the story unfolds is they got a bunch of chassidim to come stand around this bed to say l'chaim. That is tickle fabrengen. The Poritz sends someone to get him, and he says, listen, I just went through a trauma, I lost wife and children, I want he takes a leave of absence. And he obviously he does children, he does real children. How does the story come to Chabad? The story comes to Chabad is because this Yid went to the Mittel for a Tikkun Tshuva. He went to the Mittel Rebbe for Tikkun Tshuva. And the Mittel Rebbe wrote a maimed for him. There's a special essay on Bali Tshuva called Poikeach Ivrim, which is in print. And it was written for about Tshuva. And the Frierdiker Rebbe says it was written for this particular Shlomo Leib. And it's very interesting to Poikeach. It's very short. The Nekud of the Poikeach Ivrim is that about Tshuva is never allowed to hesitate. Everything right away. You hesitate, you lose. About Tshuva has to never ever pause. Go. Don't pause. Don't think. Do. Anyway, the end of the story is that this Rabbi Yosef, he waits for Shlomo Leib to recover, and he goes back home, back to his life. A little while after, he hears that the Rebbe, the middle Rebbe became a Rebbe, and he moved to Lubavitch. Remember, there was a war with France. The Rebbe moved to Liyadeh a decade before, which was far away from White Russia. Then there was a war with Napoleon. The Rebbe burned his house down, and the Rebbe passed away in Pianez, buried in Gadich. And his son, the Middler, decided to come back to White Russia and settle in Lubavitch, which is right next door to the Yajna. It's right in Lubavitch and Lajla neighbors. So he hears that there's a group of Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe who decided to go to the Middler. I think it was for Shavuos, but I don't remember. So he says to his wife, so he rents away his horse and wagon to some other Balagala. And that was the beginning of Chassidim in those days. He didn't travel to the Rebbe, they walked. There's a whole description from the Frierdiker Rebbe in the Neshima of Avon Ber Yirmiyas, how the Chassidim, they had a wagon with their packages, and they would walk and sing and fabreng. No one was in a rush. It took them weeks. And they came to Lubavitch. He went into the Middle Rebbe for the first time. When he walked into the Mittel Rebbe's face was radiant. Mittel's face was shining. And the Mittel Rebbe said to Rabbi Yosef, to this Rabbi Yosef Balagola, who was probably in his early 70s at this point, the Tate is by mir gewesen. My father visited me. Und hat mir gesagt, dass Yosef Balagola hat ausgeführt die Kavon. Tomer Yosef Balagola fulfilled the mission for which his neshama came into this world. And then the Mittel Rebbe said, the Tate hat gemacht von Agor Balagola. For the Teva from a Yochid. My father made from a Gon, a genius, a wagon driver to save one Jew. Und ich mach von a Balagola a Mashpia for the Teva from a Rabbi. And I am making from a coachman a Mashpia for the benefit of many. For a heim, forget them fed. Go home, you did your duty. And he became a Mashpia. And he was by the Yamim. This Rebbe was many, many years. He used to come to the Mittel Rebbe often. He was the Mashpia Beshinkovich. I once met Mrs. Kramer. I was going to Altera, business. Yeah, Mrs. Kramer works there. So I said to Mrs. Kramer, your father, Rabbi Chadikov, comes from a Babich Mishpacha, comes from Beshinkovich. So there you have it, Beshinkovich. This story happened in Beshinkovich. The Yosef was the Mashpia in Beshinkovich. And when he was too old to travel, too old to walk, he wouldn't travel. He didn't want to share Ganeg Mitafed. So he would send settle a pidyon with the Chassidim who came from Beshinkovich to Lubavitch. He didn't want to. And when every year, when the Chassidim would come from Beshinkovich to the Mittel Rebbe was was macht. Was macht. The Mittel Rebbe spoke about him glowingly. He was an old man, and the Mittel spoke very highly. Anyway, it's brought in. I still have from Thursday. It's brought in the Weinberg's Tanya that here was a year that did tshuva and reversed the Chilul Hashem. You see, here's a fourth level, yeah? Our Pedic has 4 levels. 4 levels. The first is Heter. The second is Issa, which affects the Gashmis. Then there's Isha, which does not affect the Gashmis. Then Issa, which is irreparable because there's a Chilul Hashem. There's a walking representation of the Aveda in the world. So this is a story. He did such a high tshuva that the Chilul Hashem was erased.
Hashem erased it.
The Rebbe tells the story is that the tshuva erased it. The tshuva erased it. In other words, even for this, there's a tikkun. Anyway, this is the story that goes along with these few lines of the Pedic. Yes, ma'am, go.